my name is Ryan Larmouth, and I am the product strategy lead at Bixel. So we're a digital services vendor, and I lead our product practice area. So I think about the ways to leverage product management best practices in government work. Plus, I'm the product manager on some of our larger engagements, and I lead product management teams. So today we're going to talk about managing the federal waterfall and what I'm calling an agile barrel. Here is the write-up that you saw in the conference materials, and it seems like a pretty straightforward problem statement. Um, Federal web projects want to go agile. They seem to be pitching projects as agile, but they have fixed start dates, fixed end dates, fixed budgets, and sometimes scope. So how are we being agile? Um, I think to really tease this out, that we're all on the same page going into this discussion, I just wanted to define some statements. For instance, I think if you ask 10 people what agile means, you get 10 definitions with some varying points of congruence, but they're not at all the same. So we're not going to solve this here, but it's just to make sure that we're using terms in the same way and understanding them. So the first is product management. Unlike project management, which is about managing set of defined tasks within a defined time frame on a defined budget, product management, as I'm using it, is really about focusing on solving a user's problem as quickly and efficiently as possible, and then improving on the solution that we deliver, uh, getting that continued feedback, learning from it, and iterating. So, the way we often speak to it in my practice area is if project management is about the how and the when, product management is really the what and the why. Um, this is just a little for instance. So, we begin with the user problem. In this case, we've got broken glass all over the floor. A product manager will look at this problem with an eye towards an MVP. And you've probably heard that thrown around. If you're not intimately familiar with it, it means minimum viable product. That also means a lot of different things to different people. Um, but the way I'm going to use it here is just to mean what is the minimum that we can provide and build that solves the user's problem. So in this case, say it's a dustpan and a broom. Maybe a very early version of this might actually just be like two pieces of cardboard, one that scrapes the glass onto the other, and it goes into the trash. Um, but over time, this is another thing that I want to point out about what I mean when I'm talking about product management. Because of the focus on the user's need and how to better solve it, this product can continue to evolve. So, from that cardboard example to the actual dustpan and broom. And over time, you might even see this evolve into a vacuum. Now, it's not at all universally agreed upon when a product evolves to the point when it becomes a new product, like is a dustpan and broom the same product as a vacuum? This is really an organizational matter. That's about the way work is organized, but it's the same user need. So, if we're talking about a website as a product, we're looking at the needs of the users and deciding what the you could say smallest site in terms of build time, but think of it as that critical mass of content and functionality that meets the user's need. And then we proceed from that, and it informs the vision of, for instance, like what is this site? It helps us clarify: are we talking about a brochure site, online service oriented site? Is it a knowledge portal? And so on. So now let's define Agile to the extent that we're going to. So this is originally a development term, and it infers a methodology. So I'm sure that many of you have worked on Agile projects and Agile development efforts, and that has a lot of different flavors. For our purposes, I figured we'd just look at the source of it all and agree to take this as our working definition. So this is from the Agile Manifesto. Google it to find out the genesis of it and who's behind it. But the important point is software developers, people involved in that process, came together and just decided these four things. So individuals and interactions, not processes and tools, working software, and so on. You can see this list. So for our purposes, we can just understand it as any methodology that puts these principles into practice. So it's really a mindset as much as anything. So, agile product management, then, from the original problem statement, just means managing the development of a product with an agile mindset. So, this can play out, like I said, any number of ways. There's many permutations of this. But common to any of these methodologies is going to be this idea of early delivery, iteration, and then continuous prioritization of user needs to inform improvement of functionality, further refinement of features, and so on and so forth. So you learn just enough about the problem to establish and deliver on a vision, solve it as quickly and efficiently as you can, get it in people's hands, continue to learn about the needs, and prioritize those that are most important. Iterate, iterate. So, why do we do this? Really these three reasons. So the first is it minimizes time to value. So from the time you've started working on a problem, you've identified how to solve it in broad strokes. You haven't spent all this time um, on some of these like distinct stages that can be very costly that you see in traditional waterfall development, which we'll get into more. The second reason, it allows for course correction. What if you think you start doing a bunch of discovery, user research, and you spend a lot of time developing a feature and then you deliver it and nobody uses it? You can course correct much more quickly if you're doing things in an agile manner. And of course, the last is to minimize the risk of spending time and money, of making sure you're not building something that doesn't sufficiently cause the problem, or you're building something that took so long that it's obsolete by the time you deliver it. So most government agencies have recognized these benefits, at least in theory. Like this is the way we want to build and then manage website products, continued iteration and improvement of them. But unfortunately, you still see or product work statements that look something like this. And this is a gross generalization, of course, but unfortunately, it's also sort of accurate in spirit. So you have a start date, an end date, a fixed budget, and then a scope that reads something like this: gather requirements, per those requirements, design the site. Then you build the site and you populate it. You test it, you go through some stage gates that are approvals of various things. You launch, but just make sure you're super agile while you're doing this. Um, Now, this is a problem, obviously, because it seems to infer that there are these distinct stages. All you need to do is gather the requirements. There is a thing called requirements. They exist out there in the wild, and you gather them all up like berries from bushes. And then once you have them, the design, well, it's just a matter of course. And then from the design, building it, that's nothing. It's a matter of course as well. You do all these things. For these requirements might be a list of all the things that a CMS needs to be able to do, all the components it has to have, the roles and permissions, and so on and so forth. So, given the size of the Drupal community, all the components and features available for a Drupal site, you can imagine if you have a distinct stage called gather requirements, how bogged down you might get in that one stage. So, none of this sounds very agile, is my point. And if you're not careful about how you approach a PWS or an SOW that looks like this, and that means both with the dev team, the product team, and the stakeholders on the business side, you may well end up in the waterfall. So here is the waterfall. Here's the cascade playing out in a sequence of stage gates. Those stage gates sometimes are between steps, so some formal review to get from, say, the approved design to the build. And sometimes they're within steps. Sometimes you might get through all of them, but then find you're going through a big waterfall right at the end. Like you've done some design and build and so forth, but all of a sudden now there's a whole series of security, compliance, et cetera reviews that's after testing, but before deployment. So the stage gates can take many forms, but in any case, they're lengthy review processes. They're based on consensus validation, and it's how software was always built in the government space until not long ago, and frankly, it still often is. Um, so this is really what we're attacking here. And when I was putting this together, I think I liked the metaphor of the waterfall and how to go over it and everything. And I started to try to be real clever about an acronym like you block a waterfall with the DAM. And maybe that stands for like decree of agile methodology or demonstration of of an agile mindset or whatever. But the more I thought about it, it just didn't work. And it's mainly just because the truth is sometimes the waterfall is just too powerful. It is ingrained in the operations and the process of the agency, maybe in the government as a whole, and it can't be completely avoided. And frankly, there are reasons it exists. When you're working on the public trust, on the public dime, there are certain things that you must, there's a level of accountability and so on and so forth you might not have in the private sector. So it's not that these things are not there for good reason, and it doesn't doom to failure any attempt to build and manage government websites in an agile fashion. And I've seen this work, and hopefully some of you had, and if not, I hope you will. So when it works, how does it work? And it usually looks something like this. So this team is going down the waterfall. They can't help it. But the nice part is, one, they're all there together. But secondly, they're in this little agile barrel that we're going to tease out this concept of, which means that their product that they're building and the iterations of it are in there with them. And with any luck, they're going to come out unscathed. They certainly have a better chance than if they weren't all in there together. And this is what's happening inside the barrel. So this barrel is the team's insulation from the forces of that waterfall all around it. So those stage gates are very slowly click, clack, click, clack. It's advancing down that waterfall, but inside it, you've got the activities constantly informing each other in the courses of quick iteration that we hope to see when building a site or any other product in an agile manner. Now, obviously, if you were to constrict this barrel further down, at some point things would be too cramped to move around the way they need to for agile development to work. So you want this barrel to be as big as it possibly can, so that all these activities can bounce around, informing each other through iteration. So we can think of this as like what determines the size of your agile barrel, the thing insulating you from those stage gates, and how do we build one in the first place? It's really a matter, the hypothesis here is that it's really a matter of the product team understanding and um, working within constraints. That is not a, an idea that's unique to government. I just wanted to point this out. Like these environmental, contractual, whatever constraints, the particular constraints might be unique to government, but the idea of a product team understanding and working within constraints is definitely not. And this is Marty Kagan, product guy, HP, eBay. It's a book inspired that, sort of a touchstone. And you can see here, like succeeding in the job of product means convincing each key stakeholder that you understand their constraints and you have to deliver a solution within them. So let's look back at the Agile Manifesto and start to try to understand how the constraints can limit the size of our barrel or restrict Agile development. This will help us understand how to overcome those constraints. So first, environmental constraints. These can be understood as cultural. So this is a matter of business as usual. This often takes the form of, this is how things are done here because this is the way we've done them. These business processes harden and people become dependent on legacy tools. Creation of documents can become a matter of course, to such an extent that the generation of them can be written into people's job descriptions and performance evaluations and so forth. So these sorts of environmental constraints can be at varying levels of formalization. You also have contractual restraints. So these are often matters of habit, except these are formalized in binding contract documentation. Um, so understanding or recognizing that many product teams building government websites are either entirely or partially staffed or led by vendors. These contracts are very comprehensive and they're negotiated, laying out a plan that all strategies agree to. So that's what we mean by contractual restraints. So the question is, given these, how do we create enough space for our agile barrel? How do we make these constraints as unrestrictive as possible? So, like I mentioned, I think first a good step is to be empathetic about why these constraints exist. Government is a large bureaucracy, it's highly structured, and that structure gives rise to processes and relies on them. And there's a dependence on facilitation tools. So it works for the people. It must meet certain standards of accountability. That's the documentation and contract piece. Because there's no profit incentive, plans arise to maintain alignment around certain goals. There's documentation associated with those. So, appreciating these things is an exercise in stakeholder empathy, and it's important for any product team, but especially a product manager to have. And it's also a key to persuasively engaging stakeholders around a product vision. You can do a lot of work to sort of expand these constraints to push back on them to the extent that's even possible if you understand why they exist in the first place and work with stakeholders to acknowledge that but figure out other ways of addressing those underlying concerns. So how do we do this? How do we get to iteration from a place of like a more waterfall sort of structure? Two ways. The first is through negotiation. So, how much structure with its attendant documentation is formally codified? So, in other words, what's proceeding according to mandate and what's just the quote unquote usual way? So, these are the environmental constraints I was talking about. You can create space and push back on the latter, those things that are just sort of, well, that's the usual way and we've just never questioned versus what's a formal mandate. Similarly, for contractual constraints, it's a matter of interpretation. So you can't change the terms of a contract, but you can work with stakeholders to delineate what's explicit versus what is merely implied. So with that PWS we mentioned, those steps that seemed so waterfall or seemed to infer it, they were not explicit. Rather, they were more implicit. Working with this within these constraints, having done some negotiation and interpretation, you can see an approach on the right that very much is an agile approach. There's nothing here that explicitly contradicts this PWS. It's just a matter of highlighting certain things, maybe reordering a little bit. Like, for instance, you notice the sequence, such as it still exists, is flipped completely upside down. The and then between the stages, which was implicit, is gone. There's nothing about gathering all requirements in the PWS that's explicit. So prioritize the launch, get something through stage gates, whatever they are, whichever can't be negotiated away or interpreted away. Get something through there. And once it's through, then you iterate on that. You test as you go, not all at once in one big stage. You always design just enough to build, and you always discover just enough to design. So the idea is, how do you get something through the stage gates as quickly as possible? One technique that I've found to be very effective is to get something down the waterfall as quickly as possible. So some early iteration of the product that meets only and distinctly like the letter of the contract and what can't be negotiated or interpreted away. And the reason for this is not because you want it to be easy going, like you don't want this is not to make it easy on the product team, because this product team should never stop the hard work of continuing to evaluate the problem, of understanding like the users better. They can be doing that while some early iteration is going down the waterfall. I'm thinking here specifically when it comes to a Drupal website of that initial launch. Oftentimes, there are a number of distinct stage gates that exist only for the first quote unquote version of a website that's about to launch, like a whole new space and whole new digital presence. If the team is working that entire time, by the time that early iteration comes through the approval processes, hopefully there is additional functionality, new features, new components, whatever that might be, that are ready for immediate deployment. And because it's no longer the first thing through, the number of stage gates there is often drastically reduced. So you might end up with a site without a lot of bells and whistles, but it gets through the waterfall. The team is safe. Here you have the agile team floating happily under the waterfall, having delivered on something, um, iterated on it as soon as it comes down and out of the waterfall. And those deployments get easier and easier. Um, Almost invariably, though, there is some additional incarnation of the waterfall. I think an important thing I want to drill home here is just that um, recognizing the environmental or contractual constraints as they arise is an ongoing process. It has to do with the environmental awareness in which the problem is arising. It's the user's need, but it's the government's problem to address it. And oftentimes, there are reasons that we mentioned for the difficulty in doing so. So, an agile team needs to be ready for waterfall after waterfall, quite frankly. The hope, though, is that product management can exist within the barrel and be going on no matter how many of these you have to go through. I think the practical questions that follow from this is who's doing that work of the interpretation and the negotiation. Um, there are many ways to address this, but one that we found effective is to try to separate the idea of project management and product management and have different people performing those roles even on the same engagement. Um, if there's any resistance to the idea of that from just like, you have to choose one or the other for purposes of a title, sometimes we think just in terms of tactical leadership versus strategic leadership on a project, with the tactical lead performing those traditional how and when project manager duties, and the strategic lead really focusing on the user problem, that what and why that establishes the initial vision and keeps agile product management moving. And that is all. I thought, we'd leave some time for questions, discussion, observations from other people who've confronted this themselves and might have something to share. Nope. Well, I think we're close to time. I'm sorry for that little delay in getting started, but thanks everybody who was able to join.
And Ryan, I actually have a quick question, if you don't mind.
Yeah, great.
So my question was about, so I'm on the government side and we're the ones trying to write these PWSs to be more like, we're an agile team. And when we hire contractors, we want them agile as well. And then we run into these hurdles where our contracting folks don't want us writing contracts like that because they're not comfortable with it, right? For many of the reasons I think we all know. So I know this was a lot of, I think, really great advice for companies responding and carrying out these contracts, but do you have any advice for us on the government side for what we can or should not be putting into these PWSs that would make it easier on you guys?
Absolutely. So a couple things. I think, and I thought about this when I was putting this together. Like, I ended up going with, the perspective I'm able to speak to, most directly. But clearly, there are huge implications for agile procurement practices. I think the idea would be to sort of like reverse engineer this, and it's sort of just in the same way that maybe a vendor would come in and start to interpret the way that a statement of work is written. Like, writing those in such a way that such interpretation is possible. The folks, you're going to get, your contract folks are going to give you pushback. But if you're able to just soften some of the language, like not you shall or do this, keep those things implicit rather than explicit that I mentioned. More and more, I think, one of the reasons I was able to speak to this is I think it's becoming more common for people like vendors such as myself to do this interpretation when they first see the documentation. And so they'll be able to see that. And it's sort of like, it's a sort of wink and nod between the folks who are asking for the work and the people performing it. And then hopefully, like, as soon as, you have that kickoff, there's a meeting of the minds and you're able to say like, yes, we can work this way within these constraints. So I think that's like a really practical, like real politic way of approaching it. I mean, clearly, like there's the harder and I think more long-term work of trying to get, contracting offices and so forth to sign on for like, well, this is the value proposition. Maybe there's data justifying, look how much money we spent on these things that we used in Agile way versus these that we did not, and that sort of comparison. But I think that's like beyond my ability to speak to intelligently.
While we might
Yeah,
need a new
yes,
generation to enter those offices.
absolutely. But
We
in
have
the
a question.
meantime, I think like it's just that willingness to sort of like look at the language and find out, how can we work with this?
Right. And I like that idea of writing it intentionally with that interpretation room.
And
Um, we have a question from Anna over in the Q&A tab.
great. Let me
So
grab
she
that.
asks, could you elaborate more about how to break out product managers versus project managers? Currently, we do not have product managers on staff. It's project managers and web devs.
So I think maybe in one step towards getting product people on staff. I mean, one way is, to start looking specifically for product people. Something that we like to do actually is look internally to people that might have any number of skill sets and train them up with enough product management learning, like just like the concepts around it, that they can serve as that strategic lead, as I was calling them. So product managers, especially in the private sector, come from all over the place. There really aren't like it's starting just to change like formal education programs where it's like you've come out of college as a product manager. Most people are sort of product management adjacent, either through content or they were engineers or they were data folks or design is a very common one and become product managers. So depending on the nature of a product build, you might look for somebody with one of those skill sets. Right now, we have a certain project going on where it's a build, and we have a UX designer fulfilling that role of a strategic lead. And I'm providing just enough support from a product management perspective to say, well, if you don't know these things about product and how it works, I'm here to provide you that support. There are plenty of training and certification programs out there around product management, as well as a ton of literature. If you do want to start sort of like an internal education effort to get people who are interested in that space to become like more strategic leads slash product managers. And specifically, if you're looking for education programs, Pragmatic Institute is one I like. I'm not affiliated, but I did some training there back in the day and can vouch for it being very good. But there are any number of good programs. Anybody else have any other questions? Oh, great. You're welcome, everybody. Yeah, if you have to hop, no worries. If you do have some questions, I'm happy to hang out for a minute here and answer them as I can.
Question.
Sure.
If no one else does. So I'm curious, working with different government agencies, if you ever encountered like a really good like hack or skip over a waterfall, like especially around the IT security side, because their IT shop, they're like way more waterfally than we are on the web dev side. And so we like in government, we butt heads with that team a lot. And so I'm curious if you found good arguments or good kind of ways around some of those gates?
So the hack is, and I was probably using soft language in the presentation, but just the kind of thing you're talking about, especially around like security and compliance and so forth. Um, the main hack is like it never says what has like a new site has to go through that, or whatever it might be, but it never says like what that means. So theoretically it could just be like hello world, and it's out there, and you have your new Drupal backend, like the CMS exists, and that's what they're
Yeah,
reviewing. And obviously like you're looking at like security ramifications, like making sure there aren't any vulnerabilities there. um, and you never want to give them something that's so thin that they don't have anything to evaluate that from. But failing that, that can be very small.
yeah,
Just because that's the first thing through, even if there's some language about like the first thing that goes through will be your launch. Well, you can soft launch, which means
yep,
like people can get to it, but nobody's going to know about it. And there's nothing there that's sensitive or anything like that. So if it's there for a while, just very no bells, no whistles, a
mhm,
thing that exists on the web, that's fine. If it takes a long time to do that, as long as you're putting that through, like from a vendor, I'm usually thinking about a period of performance. And
mhm,
I'm trying to think like, what's the earliest we can get a thing through there? So we have time to put it all the way through, wait for it to come out the other end. And then we're ready. We're like, here's another feature set. Here's
you're
basically like
updating instead of
2.0. And
yep,
that's the real launch that you would want people to see. Gives you time to not just design and develop everything, but like get content in there. I mean, all the things that take so much time with the Drupal build,
right.
in a new site. So that's my main hack.
I like
um, clearly, like what also works is like working with those security folks, like you know recognizing the things that are going to like their sensors are going to go up anytime it's like, I'm sorry, are people signing in? Oh, and you want to track their behavior behind authentication. Like, we know that there are certain hot button things that, the more you can say, like, how can we meet user needs without stepping on any of those,
yeah,
pitfalls, for now, the better. We're going to have to do it. But by then, hopefully, we have something people can use while it's going through that review. So just backloading it a little bit if you need to.
yeah. I like because literally right now we're just finishing up like our, there's nothing there, but it's like the site is there live. It's got set kit. We're like getting all set kit stuff configured, getting the CSP set up. So this is now I'm like, I could just submit it now.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing's gonna stop us. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing that can is if, your CISO takes a particular interpretation and really holds the line. But I mean, in my experience with the security folks, because like sometimes I think they even recognize like these stage gates might be a little extra, but
Right.
they also know that like this is what's expected of them. It's in their job description, like they have to
They
do
have
it.
to check the
And
box.
so they're willing to take like reasonable interpretations, and they sort of, yeah, they like leave the side door open for you that way.
Right. And I like that idea of like, we will like bring you back again with an update once we have like all the user, what we're getting the user role set up now. But like, yeah, basically, if we have some huge new feature that we're adding a new permission set or something that we know would affect security that you would care about.
Right. And then, hopefully by then, yeah, if there is a big review process through that, like something exists and is out there.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right. Very cool.
Yep. But that was like one of the reasons too. Like there can be a lot of back and forth around that whole thing, and that's why I mentioned and wanted to sort of like highlight that this idea that we're starting to lean on more, on my teams, of really separating out. I think even product managers, like you see some LCATs that are product management in government, but I think very often you get in there and what happens is those people are called product managers, but they're expected to do everything a project manager usually does, like with
Right.
contract stuff. And also, oh, and you're also a product manager. Um, I do think there's a healthy tension created by having two people working at from different angles, And it might even be better to have two people each working it at 50 than one person trying to do both at 100.
Right.
um, for what I'd call strategy and tactical, because like that tactical person's always going to have their thumb on the scale. Is like, man, if we do that, it is just a drag, and I have to redo all this stuff.
Right.
And maybe that is reason enough not to do it. That could be the case, but you should really have like that strategic person there going like, yeah, but like this is such a big deal that it's worth it, and
This
then
is
they
worth
argue
it.
it out and come
Yeah.
to a conclusion. The other part of it is like that product person can stay focused on getting the team ahead, like keeping the team aligned around the evolving vision, while sometimes the tactical person has to be over there just being like, I am literally just answering emails and like
Yes.
pestering the security folks and like, and that's a whole thing, but it's
It's like a
very
full-time job.
hard to like change your mindset from that to like, okay, why are we here again? So
Yeah.
yeah.
It's easy to get bogged down in the, oh God, I have to now. Yeah.
Sure. And I don't think like, I'm a product guy. I have no illusions of being a project manager. To me, all project managers are saints, and also, like do things with like Gantt charts and burn downs that, it makes like they need each other, I think,
Yeah.
to do this well.
Yeah. Very cool. If anyone else has questions that they want to ask verbally, you can always request to share audio video at the top.
Great. Thank you. Well, if there's no questions, I guess we'll wrap this up. But if you do have any that you think of later, I'm easy to find. You see who I am and where I work, and all my info is out there. It's just my first name dot last name at bixel.com. And I'd be happy, to correspond with anybody about these ideas, because I am in this space all the time, and so thinking about it quite a bit. But otherwise, thank you very much.
Ryan?
Alrighty, take care.